The restaurant was a hidden gem, or so the locals said. Nestled in a remote corner of the city, the Hollow Fork offered an aura of mystery with its dimly lit sign and menu that changed daily. Patrons whispered about the exquisite dishes and their special flavors, but they rarely lingered to talk about their experiences. There was something unsettling about the place, something no one could quite articulate. The restaurant was first brought to my attention by my friend Mara. She was a self-proclaimed foodie, always chasing the next big culinary adventure. When she texted me about the Hollow Fork, her message was tinged with unusual excitement and urgency. "You have to try this place. It's unforgettable." The last word lingered in my mind as I pulled up to the restaurant later that evening. Inside, the ambiance was hypnotic. Flickering candlelight danced across crimson walls adorned with framed photos of grinning diners. But the strange thing was, all the photos were slightly off. The people's eyes seemed to follow you, and their smiles felt too wide, as if they had been forced to hold a pose for hours. The maître d', an unnaturally thin man with hollow cheeks, greeted me with a bow so low it felt mocking. "Welcome," he murmured in a voice like rustling leaves. "You'll be dining alone tonight?" I nodded, unsettled by his piercing gaze. He led me to a table near the kitchen, where the smell of sizzling meat wafted out intermittently. The aroma was intoxicating, but carried a faint undercurrent of rot, like something hidden under the scent of spices. I scanned the menu, a single sheet of yellowed parchment with no descriptions, only vague names like Harvest's Blessing and The Tender Gift. I chose a dish called The Lost Cut. When the server brought it out, the dish was breathtaking. A perfectly seared piece of meat sat on a bed of garnished vegetables, but as I took my first bite, a shiver ran down my spine. The flavor was indescribable, not just savory, not just rich, but unnervingly intimate, as if the food was whispering secrets to me. I couldn't stop eating, even as nausea coiled in my stomach. I barely noticed the server return to refill my glass with a deep red wine. The liquid shimmered strangely in the dim light, its surface too thick, almost alive. Halfway through the meal, my phone buzzed. It was Mara. Her text read, "You're there? Leave now." The message made my heart pound around the room. Other diners sat silently, staring at their plates with mechanical precision, chewing and swallowing in unison. The candlelight seemed dimmer now, casting distorted shadows on the walls. A faint sound caught my attention, a soft cry, barely audible over the clinking of silverware. It came from the kitchen. My curiosity wrestled with my growing fear. I stood, intent on leaving, but as I turned, the maître appeared out of nowhere, blocking my path. "Is everything to your liking?" he asked, his voice smooth and rehearsed. I need to leave," I stammered, clutching my phone. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes grew colder. "You haven't finished your meal. I'm not feeling well." His head tilted slightly, and for a moment I thought he might insist I stay. But then he stepped aside with an exaggerated bow. "Very well. We hope you'll return." I bolted for the door, my pulse racing. Outside, the air felt sharper, fresher, as if I'd been holding my breath for hours. I called Mara, but she didn't pick up. The next day, I tried her again. No response. Concerned, I drove to her apartment. Her car was parked outside, but her windows were dark. I knocked on the door, and when there was no answer, I pushed it open. It wasn't locked. The place was eerily quiet, and a strange smell hung in the air, faint but familiar. On the kitchen counter, I found a receipt from the Hollow Fork, dated 2 nights earlier. In her bedroom, I found her phone lying on the bed. It was unlocked, her last text draft open. "It's not food." My stomach twisted. That's when I heard a creak behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I ran out of the apartment and drove straight to the police station. They listened to my story but seemed skeptical. When they visited Mara's apartment later that day, they found no trace of her or the receipt I had seen. Unable to shake the dread, I started researching the Hollow Fork. What I found made my blood run cold. Reports of missing persons stretched back decades, all linked by one common detail. Each victim had dined at the restaurant shortly before vanishing. The more I dug, the stranger the stories became. Survivors spoke of hearing screams coming from the kitchen, of feeling drugged, of tasting something human in their meals. One account, buried deep in an old forum, described the photos on the restaurant walls. "Those aren't just pictures," the poster wrote. "They're trophies." I couldn't sleep after that. I kept thinking about the maître d'aide's smile, the taste of the lost cut, and Mara's unfinished text. I tried to warn others, posting my experience online, but my posts were mysteriously deleted within hours. One night, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We're always hungry." The next day, I drove past the location of the Hollow Fork, but the building was gone. In its place stood an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. Yet, as I sat there, paralyzed, I could swear I smelled it again, that faint aroma of spices and decay, curling around me like a warning. It was a cold, rainy night when Darren pulled his car into the small roadside diner called Greeley's Grub. The neon sign above the door flickered faintly, its letters buzzing like dying flies. The place looked rundown, with peeling paint on the walls and a parking lot full of weeds breaking through cracked asphalt. Still, Darren was starving, and this was the only place for miles. Inside, the diner was strangely quiet. There were only 3 other patrons: a man in a rumpled suit nursing a cup of coffee, a pale woman with her back to the door, and an older man at the counter who seemed to be arguing with the waitress. The air smelled faintly of grease and mildew. Darren sat at a booth near the window, water droplets from the rain running down the glass like tears. The waitress came over, her eyes tired and sunken, her smile barely masking her unease. "What can I get ya?" she asked, her voice monotone. Darren glanced at the menu, but something about the items made him pause. The descriptions were vague, almost cryptic. The Traveler's Feast, Heaven's Hand, The Final Bite. He shrugged it off, assuming the names were just part of some quirky gimmick. He ordered the Traveler's Feast and a cup of black coffee. When the food arrived, it looked almost too perfect. The steak was glistening, the vegetables a vibrant, unnatural shade of green. As Darren took his first bite, the flavor exploded in his mouth, a rich, meaty taste that sent a shiver down his spine. It was better than anything he'd ever eaten, but something about it unsettled him. The meat had a strange texture, almost as if it wasn't entirely animal. As he ate, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. The rumpled man in the suit stared at him with wide, bloodshot eyes, his coffee cup trembling in his hands. The pale woman turned her head slightly, her face still obscured, but Darren could feel her gaze burning into him. Even the waitress seemed to hover nearby, watching him too closely. He put down his fork, suddenly feeling nauseous. "What's in this?" he asked, his voice shaking. The waitress's smile faltered. "Special recipe," she muttered before retreating behind the counter. The man in the suit abruptly stood and stumbled toward Darren's booth. "Don't eat it," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what you think it is. It's..." Before he could finish, the pale woman stood too, her movements unnaturally fluid. She turned fully toward Darren for the first time, and he gasped. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were black pits, and her mouth stretched impossibly wide, filled with teeth that looked like jagged shards of glass. "Sit down, Mr. Wallace," she said, her voice echoing as if it came from the depths of a cavern. The man in the suit froze mid-step, his body trembling as he slowly obeyed. Darren pushed his plate away, his heart hammering in his chest. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. The older man at the counter turned to him, his face twisted into a cruel smile. "You've been chosen," he said simply. "You should be grateful. The feast is a gift." The lights in the diner flickered, and the air grew heavy, oppressive. Darren's vision blurred as a low humming sound filled his ears. When he blinked, the room was different. The walls were no longer cracked and peeling, but slick with something dark and glistening. The other patrons were gone, replaced by shadowy figures with glowing eyes. The waitress was still there, but her skin had taken on a sickly gray hue, her hands elongated into claw-like appendages. "Chosen for what?" Darren whispered, his voice barely audible over the deafening hum. The older man stepped closer, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "To join us. You've tasted the meat, haven't you? The Traveler's Feast? It changes you, binds you to this place. The diner needs new patrons, new fuel." Darren stumbled out of the booth, his legs trembling. "I don't want any part of this," he shouted, backing toward the door. The older man's laughter was cold and hollow. "It's too late. The moment you walked in, you became part of the menu." The shadows surged toward Darren, and he bolted for the door. He pushed it open and ran into the night, the rain stinging his skin. Behind him, the diner flickered like a mirage, its neon sign buzzing louder and louder until it exploded in a shower of sparks. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. When he looked back, the diner was gone, replaced by an empty lot. But his relief was short-lived. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he noticed a strange aftertaste lingering in his mouth, metallic and bitter. In the rearview mirror, he saw something that made his blood run cold. His eyes were beginning to glow. On the outskirts of a small town stood a restaurant called the Crimson Table. It was infamous, whispered about in hushed tones. People claimed it was cursed. Patrons would vanish without a trace, their cars still parked in the lot, their belongings untouched. Others who visited said the food was so good it haunted them, leaving them with cravings that could never be satisfied. No one knew where the chef came from, and no one dared to ask. Charlie and his friends, Sarah and Paul, weren't the superstitious type. They laughed off the stories and decided to try the place for themselves one stormy evening. It was all part of their weekend thrill-seeking tradition. Urban legends, abandoned places, anything spooky. When they pulled up, the restaurant appeared oddly ordinary, except for the crimson-painted door that stood out against the dull gray facade. Lightning illuminated the building briefly, making it seem alive, breathing in sync with the storm. They hesitated for a moment, then shrugged off their unease and stepped inside. The interior was elegant, almost out of place for such a desolate location. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting soft light over velvet-draped tables. A piano played faintly in the background, though no one seemed to be playing it. The host appeared as if out of thin air, a tall man with unnervingly sharp features and hands too pale to be real. "Table for 3, he asked, his voice low and smooth. They nodded, and he led them to a table in the center of the room. The other diners were silent, their faces obscured by shadows, though the light should have been bright enough to see clearly. Sarah frowned. "Why is it so quiet in here?" "It's like a library." Paul chuckled nervously. "Maybe everyone's just focused on the food?" The menus were handed to them, black leather-bound books with gold lettering. There were no prices, just dish names that sent a chill down their spines. The first bite, sorrow's supper, eternal indulgence. Charlie waved the host over. "What do you recommend?" The man's smile widened, too far, stretching unnaturally. "The house special," he replied. "Everyone always loves it." Against their better judgment, they ordered the special. The moment the plates arrived, a strange tension filled the air. The food looked divine. Perfectly plated cuts of meat, glistening sauces, and sides that smelled of fresh herbs. Charlie, always the adventurous one, took the first bite. It was incredible. The flavors were rich and overwhelming, like nothing he'd ever tasted before. Sarah and Paul hesitated, but eventually followed suit. Each bite seemed to bring a wave of euphoria, but there was something darker beneath it, an ache, a gnawing hunger that grew stronger the more they ate. As they continued, they began to notice strange things. The other diners, who had been silent, now appeared to be watching them, their faces becoming clearer. Their eyes were black, empty voids. The music from the piano grew louder and discordant, the notes clawing at their ears. "I think we should leave," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. But Charlie couldn't stop eating. His hands shook as he shoveled forkful after forkful into his mouth. "It's too good," he muttered, his voice slurred as if he were drunk. Paul grabbed Charlie's arm. "Hey, snap out of it. This isn't normal." Suddenly, the host reappeared, his smile even wider, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Leaving already? You haven't finished your meal." "We're done," Sarah said, standing abruptly. "We're leaving." The host's smile vanished. His face twisted into something monstrous, his pale skin cracking like porcelain to reveal inky darkness beneath. The chandelier lights flickered, and the shadows around the room seemed to pulse. "You don't leave until the table is satisfied," the host growled. The floor beneath them shifted, and the room seemed to stretch endlessly. The walls writhed as if alive. The diners who had been watching stood, their movements jerky and unnatural. They stepped closer, their hollow eyes fixed on the trio. "Run!" Paul yelled, pulling Sarah toward the door. But Charlie didn't move. He was still eating, his face contorted in both ecstasy and agony. His skin had taken on a grayish hue, his eyes sunken and hollow. "Charlie, come on!" Sarah screamed. He looked up at them, tears streaming down his face. "I can't stop," he whispered. "It's eating me now." The shadows swallowed him as he let out a final scream, his body dissolving into the crimson-lit void. Sarah and Paul ran for the door, but it felt miles away. The host's laughter echoed around them, mingling with the dissonant piano music. The shadows reached out, grasping at their feet, their arms pulling them back. Just as Sarah's hand brushed the crimson door, Paul was yanked into the darkness. His screams were cut short, leaving only the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing. She burst through the door into the rain, collapsing on the wet ground outside. When she looked back, the restaurant was gone. In its place stood an empty field, overgrown and silent. Days later, Sarah returned with the police, desperate to find answers, but there was no trace of the restaurant or her friends. The locals shook their heads when she asked about the Crimson Table, claiming they'd never heard of it. But every night, as Sarah tried to sleep, she could still hear the piano playing faintly, and the taste of the food haunted her dreams. Worse still, she was starting to feel hungry again, an insatiable hunger that no food could satisfy. The Willow's Edge Cafe sat at the edge of an old forest, its quaint facade and rustic charm beckoning travelers who wandered too far from the main road. It was the kind of place you'd find in postcards. Ivy climbing up the brick walls, warm lights glowing in the windows, and a smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. Yet, locals avoided it, muttering warnings that fell on deaf ears. For Mia, a college student with a penchant for exploring offbeat locations, the cafe seemed perfect. She had read about it online, reviews praising the food as life-changing and the ambiance as unforgettable. So on a chilly autumn afternoon, she made the hour-long drive to try it herself. The first sign something was off came when she arrived. The parking lot was empty, but the cafe door was propped open, as if waiting just for her. A bell jingled softly as she stepped inside, and the warmth enveloped her immediately, a sharp contrast to the biting cold outside. The place looked exactly as advertised, charming, cozy, and meticulously clean. A woman emerged from behind the counter, her smile unnaturally wide, her gray hair tied into a pristine bun. "Welcome to Willow's Edge. You're just in time for our special." Mia smiled politely and sat at a small table near the window. The woman didn't hand her a menu, but instead brought over a steaming bowl of soup, its aroma so tantalizing that Mia's stomach growled. "It's on the house today," the woman said, her voice as smooth as honey. Mia hesitated but took a sip. The flavor was unlike anything she'd ever tasted, rich, savory, and oddly nostalgic. It reminded her of her grandmother's cooking, the warmth of childhood winters spent by the fire. She finished the bowl quickly, her hunger only growing. "Would you like more?" the woman asked, already placing another bowl in front of her. Mia nodded, almost instinctively. As she ate, the cafe seemed to shift. The air grew thicker, the light dimmer. She glanced out the window, but the forest beyond was now cloaked in mist. The trees seemed closer, their gnarled branches pressing against the glass like skeletal fingers. When she finally set the spoon down, she noticed something strange. Her reflection in the window looked wrong. Her eyes were darker, her skin pale. She blinked, and the image corrected itself, but unease prickled at her spine. "Was it to your liking?" the woman asked, appearing beside her table without a sound. "Yes," Mia said, forcing a smile. "It was amazing. How much do I owe you?" The woman's smile widened further, stretching her lips unnaturally. "Oh, we don't take money here. Payment comes in other forms." Mia froze. "What do you mean?" The woman tilted her head, her eyes glinting. "You've taken something from us. Now we'll take something from you." The lights in the cafe flickered, and the warmth turned stifling. Mia's vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin. She tried to stand, but her legs felt like lead. "Let me go," she shouted, her voice weak. "You came to us hungry, didn't you?" the woman said, leaning closer. Her face was no longer human, her features distorted, her eyes black pits. "We feed the hungry, but every meal has its cost." Mia's body felt like it was dissolving, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. She looked down and screamed. Her hands were fading, turning translucent, her skin flaking away like ash. "Don't worry," the woman crooned. "You'll always be part of Willow's Edge, and someday, someone else will taste you in the soup." The last thing Mia saw before darkness swallowed her was the mist pressing against the windows, wrapping around the cafe like a hungry beast. Weeks later, a couple driving through the area stopped at Willow's Edge Cafe. They raved about the soup in their online review, calling it the best they'd ever had. No one noticed the faint echo of a scream woven into their glowing words. Late one night, a group of friends stumbled upon an old, decrepit diner called the Midnight Spoon. Its neon sign blinked erratically, casting an eerie green glow over the parking lot. They weren't supposed to be there. The building had been condemned years ago, a notorious site for urban legends about disappearances. But that only made it more appealing to the group's ringleader, Ethan, who was always chasing the thrill of a good scare. "One picture inside," Ethan grinned, waving his phone. "Come on, it'll make a great story." Reluctantly, his friends, Mark, Jess, and Lily, followed him. The door creaked open as if inviting them in. The interior was frozen in time. Dust coated the booths, the counter, and the soda fountain. A faint smell of mildew hung in the air, but there was something else too. The faint aroma of frying bacon, as if someone had just been cooking. "Creepy," Jess muttered, shining her flashlight around. Her beam landed on a menu board behind the counter, its faded letters spelling out unsettling items like soul stew and lost and found pie. "Fake," Ethan scoffed. "Probably set up for some viral stunt." "Yeah, right," Mark mumbled, but his voice wavered. Lily was the first to notice the sound, a faint clinking, like silverware tapping on a plate. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The group froze. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, as if someone were dining in the shadows of the diner. Ethan's flashlight caught movement at the far end of the room. "Hello?" he called out. No response. Against better judgment, they moved closer. In the corner booth, they saw it, a man sitting alone, his back to them, hunched over a plate. His hand moved methodically, lifting a fork to his mouth and back to the plate. "Hey, man," Ethan said, his bravado faltering. The figure didn't turn around. His movements became jerky, unnaturally fast, the fork scraping against the plate. Jess stifled a scream as she noticed something glistening and black oozing from the corners of the man's mouth. "Let's get out of here," Lily said, tugging on Ethan's arm. But the man turned suddenly, his face illuminated in the flashlight's beam. His eyes were hollow sockets, his skin stretched tight over his skull. His mouth hung open, black liquid dripping onto his plate. "Stay," he rasped, his voice like shattered glass. "The special is fresh tonight." The lights flickered violently, and the diner came alive. The jukebox blared a distorted tune, and the air filled with the sound of clattering dishes and utensils. The doors slammed shut behind them, locking with a deafening clang. Panic set in. They ran for the kitchen, hoping for another exit. Inside, the air was thick with steam, and the smell of cooking meat turned their stomachs. Jess pulled back a curtain, revealing a row of hanging carcasses. Not animals, but human forms, their faces frozen in expressions of horror. "Oh my God," Mark choked, stumbling back. A low growl came from the shadows. Knives on the counter began to rattle, then lifted into the air, spinning like grotesque clock hands. The sound of laughter echoed through the room, deep, guttural, and inhuman. "They're not going to let us leave," Lily whispered, tears streaming down her face. Ethan grabbed a cast-iron skillet and swung wildly as a shadow lunged at them, knocking over a rack of pans. "Go! Keep moving!" They burst through another door, finding themselves back in the dining area, but it was different now. The booths were full, every seat occupied by lifeless patrons. Their heads turned in unison as the group entered, their faces a collage of decay and rot. The man from the corner booth was now standing at the counter, his grin impossibly wide, black liquid cascading down his chin. "You can't leave until you're full," he growled, slamming a bell on the counter. The room began to warp, the walls bending inward as if the diner itself was alive and hungry. The friends screamed as the shadowy patrons stood, their skeletal hands reaching out. Ethan was the first to be pulled under, his cries muffled as the floor seemed to swallow him whole. Jess and Mark clawed at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Lily turned to help them, but something cold wrapped around her ankle, dragging her toward the gaping maw of the booth. The last thing Jess saw before the shadows consumed her was the man behind the counter raising his fork in a mock toast. "Welcome to the menu," he said with a chuckle. Days later, the police found Ethan's car parked outside the diner. Inside, everything was untouched except for a single plate on the counter. On it was a slice of pie, its filling dark and glistening, and beneath it, a handwritten note. "The special is always fresh." In a quiet seaside town, there was a restaurant called the Tide's Rest. It was built right on the edge of a rocky cliff, overlooking the endless, churning ocean. The place had a strange reputation. People said the food was so good that it would change your life. But others whispered darker tales about those who entered and were never seen again. Claire, a freelance travel blogger, had heard about it while researching local attractions. Skeptical of the ominous rumors, she decided to visit. If nothing else, it would make a compelling story for her blog. When she arrived, the building seemed almost too perfect. Its whitewashed walls gleamed against the setting sun, and the windows glowed warmly, promising comfort. The smell of the ocean mingled with something richer, savory, that made her mouth water. Inside, the decor was minimalist, but elegant, with pale wood and soft candlelight. The dining room was empty, except for a single waiter standing near the entrance. He was tall and gaunt, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to reflect the sea. "Welcome, miss," he said, his voice smooth and unplaceable. "You're just in time for our catch of the day." "How do you know my name?" Claire asked, startled. "We know all our guests," he replied with a small, unsettling smile. Claire's unease grew, but she told herself it was just part of the restaurant's gimmick, and she sat at a table near the window, the waves crashing violently against the rocks below. The waiter handed her a menu, though it only had one item. "The catch." "I'll go with the special, then," she said, forcing a laugh. The waiter bowed and disappeared into the kitchen. Minutes later, he returned with a silver platter. On it was a single fillet of fish, golden and glistening with butter. The smell was intoxicating. Claire hesitated, but took a bite. The flavor was indescribable, like the essence of the ocean distilled into perfection. She couldn't stop eating, each forkful more delicious than the last. When the plate was clean, the waiter returned. "Did you enjoy your meal?" "It was amazing," Claire admitted, though a strange heaviness settled in her chest. "Excellent," he said, his smile widening. "The chef would like to meet you. If you'll follow me?" Claire hesitated, but nodded. She was curious and a little flattered that her meal warranted a meeting with the chef. She followed the waiter down a narrow hallway to a door marked Kitchen. As soon as the door closed behind her, she realized her mistake. The room wasn't a kitchen at all. It was a cavern, its walls slick with salt water. The floor was uneven stone, and the air was thick with the smell of brine and decay. At the center of the cavern stood a massive, tank-like structure filled with murky water. The chef emerged from the shadows, but he wasn't human. His body was elongated and twisted, his skin glistening like the scales of a fish. His eyes were black and unblinking, and his mouth was filled with jagged teeth. "What is this?" Claire stammered, backing away. "The Tide's Rest does not simply serve meals," the waiter said from behind her, his voice now cold and distant. "We feed the sea, and tonight the sea has chosen you." The tank began to bubble violently, and something enormous stirred beneath the surface. Claire's heart pounded as she realized the truth. The catch of the day wasn't a dish. It was a sacrifice. She turned to run, but the waiter grabbed her arm, his grip impossibly strong. "You enjoyed the meal," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Now it's time to pay the price." The creature in the tank rose, its massive form breaking the surface. Its body was a horrifying blend of fish and nightmare, with glowing eyes and tentacles that writhed like living shadows. Claire screamed as the tentacles shot toward her, wrapping around her waist and pulling her toward the tank. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the chef's twisted grin and the waiter bowing politely. The next morning, the Tide's Rest stood empty, its doors locked and windows dark. The only sign of Claire was her car, still parked outside, and her laptop sitting on the passenger seat with a single draft post open. The catch of the day is worth the trip, but beware, it might just be your last. There was a small, unassuming bistro on the edge of the city called Marrow. It had no sign, no advertisements, and no social media presence. Yet anyone who'd been lucky or unlucky enough to eat there swore it was the best food they'd ever tasted. The bistro didn't take reservations. You had to stumble upon it at the right time. That's exactly how Alex found it. He was driving home late after a grueling workday when his stomach growled. On a dark, winding road, a faint glow caught his eye. He slowed and saw the warm light spilling from a building that hadn't been there the last time he drove this route. Above the door was a single, hand-painted word: Marrow. Hungry and curious, Alex decided to stop. Inside, the bistro was small but elegant. Candlelight flickered on tables set with pristine white linens. Soft classical music played from nowhere in particular. A man in a crisp white apron appeared as Alex sat. "Welcome," he said, his voice deep and melodic. "You've come at the perfect time." Alex chuckled nervously. "Just lucky, I guess." The waiter smiled but didn't hand him a menu. Instead, he said, "We offer one dish each night. Tonight's is braised delights. Alex was too hungry to argue. Sounds great, he said. When the dish arrived, it was stunning, tender chunks of meat in a rich, dark sauce paired with roasted vegetables. The aroma alone was enough to make Alex's mouth water. The first bite was euphoric. The meat melted in his mouth and the flavors danced on his tongue. He ate quickly, savoring each bite until the plate was spotless. That was incredible, Alex said as the waiter returned. Wonderful, the waiter replied. Would you like to see where the magic happens? Alex hesitated, but then nodded, curiosity piqued. The waiter led him through a door marked kitchen. Inside, the air was thick with heat and the scent of simmering spices. Pots bubbled on the stove and knives glinted under the dim light. But what caught Alex's attention was a large wooden butcher's block in the center of the room. On it lay a piece of raw meat, still glistening. This is where every dish begins, the waiter said, gesturing to the block. It looks fresh, Alex said, trying to make small talk, though something about the setup unsettled him. Very fresh, the waiter replied, his smile sharpening. Before Alex could respond, the waiter reached behind him and pressed a switch. The walls of the kitchen began to shift, revealing hidden panels. Behind the panels were rows of human limbs, torsos, and organs, carefully arranged like fine cuts of beef in a butcher shop. Alex stumbled back, his stomach lurching. What the hell is this? Your meal, the waiter said simply. Alex's mind raced as the truth dawned on him. He looked at the meat on the block again, this time noticing the faint impression of a tattoo on its surface. Oh my God! The waiter stepped closer, blocking the door. Don't be ungrateful, he said. You've enjoyed our craft. It's only fair that you contribute. Alex turned to run, but the kitchen staff emerged from the shadows, silent, expressionless, their aprons soaked in blood. One of them carried a cleaver, its edge gleaming. He fought and screamed, but they were too strong. The last thing Alex saw was the butcher's block as he was forced onto it, the cleaver raised high. The next day, Marrow was gone, leaving no trace of its existence. But somewhere on a dark road in another town, a faint glow appeared in the night, and a sign above a door read, Tonight's Special, Braised Delights. On the outskirts of a sleepy town, there was an infamous diner called Eddie's Midnight Feast. Open only from dusk till dawn, it was said to serve food so exquisite it was addictive. But the townsfolk avoided it, speaking in hushed tones about the patrons who entered but never returned. For James, a traveling salesman passing through, it was just another roadside diner. Exhausted and starving after a long day, he saw the neon sign flicker in the distance and decided to stop. The parking lot was empty, but the diner was lit up like a beacon. As he stepped inside, a chill ran through him. The air smelled of grease and something metallic, though he couldn't quite place it. The interior was strangely pristine, almost too perfect. Polished chrome, spotless booths, and a jukebox softly playing a tune that James couldn't recognize but felt oddly nostalgic. Behind the counter stood a man in a faded white apron. He looked up with a grin that didn't reach his hollow eyes. "Welcome to Eddie's," he said. "You're just in time for the feast." James chuckled. "You've got one hell of a tagline." The man didn't laugh. Instead, he handed James a laminated menu, though it only had 3 items. 1, soup of shadows. 2, the endless plate. 3, eternal dessert. James frowned. Bit dramatic, don't you think? The man's smile widened. "We take our food very seriously here." Hunger won out over hesitation, and James ordered the endless plate. The man nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving James alone. As he waited, he noticed something odd. The diner had no windows, just mirrored panels that reflected the empty booths. Minutes later, the man returned with a steaming plate piled high with food. Meat, vegetables, bread, it all looked and smelled divine. "Enjoy," the man said, his voice low and reverent. James dug in, and the taste was indescribable. Every bite seemed to unlock a new memory. His grandmother's kitchen, a picnic with old friends, meals shared with people long gone. The flavors were so rich, so vivid, that tears welled in his eyes. But as he ate, a strange thing happened. No matter how much he ate, the plate remained full. At first, James thought it was a clever trick. He kept eating, determined to clear the plate, but the portions never shrank. The food seemed to multiply with every bite, and his stomach began to ache. "Hey," James called out, his voice strained. "What's the deal? I'm full." The man behind the counter didn't answer. Instead, the jukebox stopped playing and the mirrors lining the walls began to shimmer. James froze. In the reflections, the booths weren't empty. Shadows sat in each one, indistinct but human-like, their heads turned toward him. "Hello?" James whispered, his voice trembling. One by one, the shadows stood. They glided across the diner, their forms becoming clearer with each step. Faces began to emerge, faces James recognized. His father, who'd died when he was a child, a high school friend who'd vanished on a hiking trip, a girlfriend who'd died in a car accident. "What is this?" James demanded, backing away from the table. The man behind the counter finally spoke. "You're dining with those who came before you. They all enjoyed the feast, and now, so will you." James turned to run, but the mirrored walls stretched endlessly, trapping him in a maze of reflections. The shadows closed in, their hands cold and firm as they pushed him back into his seat. The plate in front of him changed. The food began to rot, turning black and oozing a foul-smelling liquid. Yet the shadows forced the fork into his hand, guiding it to his mouth. "You must finish," the man said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "The feast doesn't end until you do." James screamed as the shadows consumed him, his body sinking into the booth like it was swallowing him whole. The next morning, the diner was gone. But travelers on the road would swear they could still hear faint laughter and the clinking of silverware carried on the wind. And in the diner's place, a new sign appeared. "Welcome to Eddie's Midnight Feast. Open from dusk till dawn. Come hungry." On a desolate stretch of highway, there was a diner called the Hollow Hearth. It appeared out of nowhere on foggy nights, its neon sign flickering weakly, barely visible through the haze. Locals warned travelers about it, saying that no one who ate there ever truly left. One cold, misty night, Mia, a long-haul trucker, found herself lost on that very stretch of road. Her stomach growled, and her gas tank was dangerously low. Relief washed over her when she saw the dim glow of the Hollow Hearth ahead. The parking lot was empty, but the diner itself was brightly lit, almost too inviting. Inside, the decor was retro, checkered floors, red vinyl booths, and a jukebox playing a soft, haunting melody. A waitress stood behind the counter, her eyes fixed on Mia as if she'd been expecting her. "Take a seat, honey," the waitress said, her voice sweet but distant. "You've had a long drive." Mia hesitated. The place felt wrong, too clean, too quiet, but her hunger won out. She slid into a booth near the window, though when she glanced outside, the fog was so thick she couldn't see her truck anymore. The waitress handed her a menu, but it was blank. I think this one's a misprint," Mia said, laughing nervously. The waitress smiled, her teeth just a little too sharp. "We serve what you need, not what you want." Before Mia could respond, the waitress walked away, disappearing into the kitchen. Moments later, she returned with a plate. On it was a single steak, perfectly cooked, with a side of mashed potatoes and green beans. Mia didn't ask questions. The smell alone was enough to make her mouth water. She took a bite and felt warmth spread through her body, erasing the exhaustion from her long drive. "This is amazing," she said, looking up. But the waitress was gone. As Mia ate, strange things began to happen. The diner's lights dimmed, and the jukebox fell silent. The air grew colder, and when she looked at the window again, the fog had cleared. Outside wasn't the highway anymore. It was nothing. Just endless blackness, as if the diner were floating in a void. "Hello?" Mia called out, her voice trembling. The waitress appeared again, but her face had changed. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits, and her smile stretched impossibly wide. "Was it everything you needed?" she asked. "What the hell is going on?" Mia demanded, standing up. The waitress didn't answer. Instead, the other patrons appeared, silent figures who filled the booths that had been empty moments before. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their eyes fixed on Mia. She stumbled back toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged as the figures began to rise, their movements slow and deliberate. "You can't leave," the waitress said, her voice echoing. "Not until you settle the bill." "What bill? I didn't even order this." The waitress stepped closer, holding out a slip of paper. On it was a single word, scrawled in crimson: debt. Mia's legs gave out as the truth hit her. This wasn't a diner. It was a trap. The food had been more than a meal. It had taken something from her. Her energy, her will, her very essence. The figures closed in, their hollow eyes filled with hunger. The waitress leaned down, whispering in Mia's ear, "Welcome to the Hollow Hearth. You're on the menu now." The lights flickered, and Mia's screams were swallowed by the void. The next morning, a passing trucker saw an empty stretch of road where the hollow hearth had been. All that remained was an overturned coffee cup, still warm to the touch, sitting in the middle of the pavement.